Hi, this week's we're going to really focus on the notion about the ethics of collaboration, which is really about building a moral community within and amongst healthcare professionals for the betterment of patient care and patient care outcomes. But before we get into the content for today, what I did want to do is also walk you through the notion about the decision-making framework and the ethical decision-making frameworks that are available to us to support looking at ethical dilemmas and coming to a resolution. This is not only important for us to have as part of our practice, but also, again, this is a necessary step, again, looking at your scholarly paper and how that'll go forward. So what we use decision-making frameworks, like all our other decision-making frameworks, whether it be the nursing process or other types of frameworks that helps us as nurses to walk through a particular scenario to come to a preferred outcome. So these decision-making frameworks are used to guide ethical analysis and to find solutions to the various ethical dilemmas that we will come across. And it involves a purposeful step to support ethical reasoning and decision making. And it really is about, again, coming to a resolution, an action that is truly within the patient's best interest. Why use a framework? Again, just as all the other frameworks that support our nursing practice, it really helps us to take into account what are the specific ethical issues, what might be some models or the theories that could actually be applied in this particular scenario. What are the various influences that are actually contributing to this, and how do we actually bring together these different factors and looking at, again, coming up with some potential actions and resolutions. Frameworks also help us to, again, look at what can be very problematic ethical dilemmas in a very systematic way. Again, really help us to understand what are the options, what are all the various factors at play, and again, how do we work through this in a systematic way that again supports best actions to support patient outcomes. This is the framework that's identified in your text. And again, you may find this useful as you start to address the ethical situations and dilemmas you've identified for your paper, but also as part of a very useful framework to add into your toolbox in terms of your overall nursing practice. So what this looks at in terms of this particular decision-making framework is obviously you're going to start, just like with the nursing process, to assess. What are the ethics of the situation at hand? What are the goals, the discrepancy within goals, different beliefs and values that are coming into play here? So doing that in-depth assessment about, so exactly what is the issue here and what is the ethical dilemma, who is experiencing the ethical dilemma, and what are some of the various factors. After you've done your assessment, looking at reflecting and reviewing on potential actions items. So what are the options available to us here? And again, depending on the, the different ethical frameworks or theories or lens that people may be applying, you're going to have different actions and different opportunities and different thoughts in terms of potential actions. So you look at potential actions, you're going to select which action you think is the one that will maximize the good to the most. Again, thinking about going back to your paper, so with the 5 different options, which one do you think is actually the best one? And then moving beyond just your paper, but in terms of nursing practice, once you've selected an ethical action that you think is going to maximize the good, you would actually implement that action and engage in that ethical action. And as always, reflecting or evaluating on whether or not that particular ethical action actually contributed to the greatest good in terms of what is important for the patient. So this is just one particular framework that allows us, again, to approach ethical dilemmas in a very systematic way, very similar as we do with all other frameworks that we use with nursing in terms of assessment, developing an action plan, implementing that action plan, and evaluating that action plan. So again, you can see very specifically how consistent that is with the overall nursing process. This is another ethical decision-making framework from Jan Storch that again looks at, it's very similar in nature in terms of the overall process, but it provides a different spin on it. So again, the overall assessment, you're going to gather information identification, speaking with all the parties involved, what's going on, collecting all your information, considering what's the values that are involved, whose values, are they consistent, are they at a disconnect with one another, what are the ethical principles involved, So again, this is where you may be looking at what are the various ethical theories that may be involved here. What are the expectations in terms of societal expectations, in terms of norms and values? What might be some legal requirements in here in terms of rules, perhaps, that are guiding or interfering with the ethical dilemma? And then, just as before, what are your ranges of actions? What are also the consequences, so the pros and cons of each action? And then looking at coming to consensus, again, on which one is the most appropriate. So again, these are just some examples of decision-making frameworks that can help us as healthcare professionals kind of navigate the quagmire of what can be sometimes some very complex ethical dilemmas. So keeping the emotions out of it, but doing a very systematic assessment in terms of coming up with actions and items that, again, so will support excellent patient care. So just wanted to walk through these in a more formal way. So that we have a discussion with regards to these ethical decision-making frameworks as a support to our own nursing practice, but also as a key element, if you will, in terms of your scholarly paper, in terms of approaching your ethical dilemma. Okay, so now let's get into the content for class for today. As members of the larger interprofessional team, as well as the nursing interprofessional team, the notion about collaborative care and developing that moral community of practice is really quite important to us because of the nature of our work. So today what we're going to focus in on in terms of the content for this particular section is really looking at the whole notion about creating this moral and ethical community, and how does interprofessional collaboration intersect with each other and actually support or sometimes act as a barrier to this development of this moral and ethical community. The notion about interprofessional collaboration we're going to talk about again in a little bit more detail. And again, how do we really build this together to really support ongoing excellence in patient care? So this whole notion about, is collaborative practice a moral and ethical imperative? And you would think, recognizing the importance of the evidence that we do see, that collaborative practice really does improve health outcomes and promote safe patient care. The Institute of Medicine report that came out a few years ago, actually in 2010, that talked about the future of nursing and the importance of care, really identified that 75% of all adverse events that occur to patients are as a result of poor team communication and collaboration. And that's just really something that is just not acceptable. So we really want to look at the whole notion about interprofessional collaboration really being about breaking down those silos between professions and really looking at making sure that the patient gets the best of all the participation of the knowledge that we each bring to patient care. So I really liked this quote in terms of from the Brighton-Brachman article that was part of today's readings, is that really the motivation to work collaboratively across professions is a moral one, given the recognition that not any one discipline can really account for the full diversity of healthcare needs. So it is the recognition that although we all have distinct and unique nature in terms of what we contribute to patient care, we simply cannot do this alone. And how is it that we, again, really need to bring all of that expertise together for the betterment of patient care and health system outcomes? So really about collaborative practice, it's about coming together to meet the patient's defined goals. So really looking at how do we come together with that patient in the center and look at what are their goals, what are their needs, and how do individually and yet collectively do we come together to address this, recognizing that, again, it should be the patient in the center. But again, this is always an interesting component here. So, when we do come together, and perhaps you've seen this already in your practice, if I have my disciplinary knowledge, I may view what I think is in the patient's best interest differently than another professional colleague. And this is where we get into some of the discussions about which goals then take priority, whose voices get heard. I think we're going to spend some time talking about the Carol Awashun article that gave you those different scenarios about, whose voices sometimes gets heard and what does that mean in terms of overall patient care and team complements. So, if you think about this, underlying assumption, using the feminist lens in terms of the notion about power and equity and injustices, and the consequentialist theory in terms of, what are the consequences or potential negative outcomes if a certain voice takes priority. So what's involved with interprofessional care? And interprofessional collaboration or interprofessional education. This notion about the interprofessional collaboration in practice involves working with different knowledges, practices, and values orientations for patient care. Whether you go to school for nursing, medicine, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, we all have a very unique lens through which we see patient care and patient care needs, and that therefore informs what we see as to be the opportunities, actions required, et cetera, et cetera. And so sometimes, there are issues with regards to power differentials and how people see things. So we really need to look at that from that perspective and be really quite conscious to this. The goal is for equitable team membership and equity in relationships and dialogue. There are power differentials in terms of, let's say, with physicians and other members of the team. But the notion is here that we really do want to come together as equitable team members, all here again for that patient in the center. So again, Malleus really talks about that this whole notion about equitable team membership and equity in relationship, until we really replace this notion about medicine as having a privileged narrative, that power differential will continue to perhaps create a barrier. I will tell you, I see now with more and more emphasis on collaborative practice, interprofessional collaboration, particularly also within medicine school, is that you see more and more of the physicians that have been coming out over the last 5 years or so, they have a full expectation that they will participate as part of an interprofessional team and participate as a member and really look at equal contributions and from the various members of the team, because they also themselves know they don't know it all. Physicians rely on pharmacists to provide them with that expertise. They rely on nurses and physiotherapists and occupational therapists to really implement that plan of care and really fully facilitate patients achieving those goals. So we really need to look at, so what are the historical situations, but how perhaps that dialogue and that discourse is actually changing. So thinking about from the power differentials, perhaps it would be a time just to think about from your perspective, what are some of the other barriers to collaborative care? Some of the other influences that really contribute to perhaps either enabled collaboration or perhaps some of the barriers to collaboration are even just the cultural backgrounds and the focus of each individual profession. So medicine, and sometimes we'll say more so the sciences, really privilege and embrace more of a detached observation and rational explanation of things. Whereas nursing, as we know, is really recognizing about the relationships, so relational ethics and the relationships we have with our patients, and really looking at the focus of our attention on that uniqueness of the individual. So I'll call your attention back to our various nursing theorists, and very much looking at that from Watson in terms of the theory of human caring, and Parsi with human becoming, really recognizing and fully embracing, as Watson would say, that spirit-filled person, and then who Parsi would say is, ever-changing, cannot be truly defined. So if you can imagine in terms of the from different paradigms through which different professions approach patient care, you can see then where, again, this could actually either enable or perhaps sometimes acts as a barrier to collaborative practice, because, again, just as this last bullet point says, based on that paradigm will define or determine or strongly influence what you see as being the central ethical issue at that particular point in time. The other assumptions about interprofessional collaboration is that it's good and it will always lead to good, that it is oriented to the good and with the focus on really achieving the best optimal components for patients. The other assumption is that this virtuous practitioner would want to have the skills to practice well in terms of interprofessional collaboration. And again, so looking at that, the CNA value statements about collaborative practice, the notion about even from the College of Nurses of Ontario in terms of the standards about therapeutic relationships, the standard about relationships in terms of with professional colleagues as well as with patients. The other assumption is that other healthcare professionals, just because we're all healthcare professionals, is that we have a shared and common view, and that's not necessarily the case. The other assumption is that patients do see interprofessional collaboration as contributing to good. Recognizing that they've got this team around them to support them. So again, I have you, perhaps to stop the tape here and have a think about that in terms of, are these assumptions valid? What perhaps might be some other assumptions that we have about interprofessional collaboration? I think one of the other assumptions that we have is that it just naturally occurs. It's easy. How hard could it be? So I really think we have to look at how do we start to build capacity to support interprofessional collaboration, knowing what we know in terms of the overall benefits and the values of it. So here are the various competencies related to collaborative practice, and really looking at some of these different areas. And we're going to touch upon this in a little bit more detail because we've actually had some conversations about this in DOS 2 and Professionhood. So in other words, what I really like about this, you can talk about the competencies in terms of communication, that we should be family and patient centered. It requires teamwork, role clarification, collaborative leadership, and the ability to resolve conflicts. But what I really like is about this statement here. It's the underlying mental models. In order to collaborate, you must trust the other professional is competent and have some idea of what they can contribute. Therefore, respect and relationships are actually central. And it's so true. And I think we can see this in some of the relationships, that regardless of what the team member may want to bring to the table, if we don't perceive that person as being competent, or we don't value what it is that they want to bring to the table, collaboration simply does not occur. So looking at some of those particular areas. This, you may recall from your readings and discussions in DOS 2, is the National Competency Framework for Interprofessional Collaboration. And this really touches upon those competencies that we just mentioned in the previous slide. The expectation is that, we need to understand our roles within the interprofessional team, to value and embrace the distinct and overlapping nature of the roles that we bring, and to value and respect that it is about team functioning in terms of looking at the members of the interprofessional team and looking at really enable professional team collaboration, that we understand the principles of team dynamics, good, bad, and different, but we understand that as we go forward. That we do engage with self and others in dealing effectively with interprofessional conflict. There will always be, regardless of how well a team functions, there will always be some degree of conflict. Or situations where there will be conflict. That's just the nature of the beast, so to speak. But it's about how do we effectively deal with conflict and resolve those conflicts. And the notion about collaborative leadership is that all of us work together with all participants, including our patients and families, to really look at services that really enhance health outcomes, that we all have a role, a leadership role in looking at that. Obviously, this is all the ultimate goal. The partnership between a team of health professionals and the client in a participatory, collaborative, and coordinated approach to shared decision making around health and social issues. So really looking at, how does all of this contribute to really effective interprofessional collaboration? And the one thing I want to point out here in this particular model is not underestimating the impact of context in terms of the actual immediate environment, perhaps the culture of the patient care unit, the culture of where care is being provided, larger contextual issues, perhaps what's going on in the broader healthcare sector. So again, taking on the notion about environmental factors that also perhaps can contribute to this. One of the examples might be, if you look at the notion about role clarification, some of the contextual factors here, we've got an impending change with regards to perhaps RN prescribing. So that's happening within the larger context of healthcare systems and nursing professional practice. So you can imagine what that might have, impact might have on role clarification, team functioning, et cetera, et cetera. So not to withstand the impact of some of those outer factors, particularly the contextual ones that also can have an impact on interprofessional team collaboration. And the readings this week I thought were really quite intriguing in terms of really focusing on the role from a nursing perspective. So really looking at, that nursing ethics is more about just being a good nurse in everyday practice. It is really about that, but I love this phrase in terms of really what nursing attempts to do is to maximize the good and minimize the bad. And wouldn't that be a lovely way of just kind of getting yourself throughout the day? And the fact that really, we are obligated to be collaborative because we know that collaboration maximizes health benefits and really looks at creating environments that are really supportive of a moral community. And recognizing that the notion about, collaborative practice is really about recognizing that each profession is respected and enabled. And that we really do have to identify where there are issues of turf protection, professional tribalism, so to speak, and how do we, as opposed to ignore them, how do we really examine what are some of the underlying issues? So some reflective questions for you here in terms of, and again, we've had many of these conversations really in DOS too, excuse me, where we talked about, some of the hierarchical issues between registered nurses and registered practical nurses, how that gets translated to our PSW colleagues, the hierarchy sometimes between nursing and other professions, and that can also be sometimes very context specific, going back to the model that we saw in the previous slide. One example I'll give you from my practice is in working in a rehab facility, because the whole focus was on the rehabilitation of the patient, so to speak, the rehab professionals had more power. So physio and OT kind of ran the show, and nursing feeling very devalued. Particularly when talking about, interprofessional rounds, that physicians would really defer to the physios and the OTs in terms of overall patient status, patient goals, patient plan of care, and nursing really felt like they were just barely there to be custodians, to get the patients ready for physio and OT. So even within specialty areas, within healthcare, there can be some hierarchies. That can be, they are unassumed, unarticulated, but they're very, very present, and they can actually, really interfere with effective collaboration. So other things to really look at in terms of the notion about turf protection, or the other phrase you might hear is professional tribalism, where people are desperate to protect their turf and trying to see what might be some of the underlying issues regarding that from an ethical perspective, and what are the potential consequences of that. The next notion is the notion about relational ethics. And again, what I really liked about the article, the Wright article that really spoke about, relational approach to ethics doesn't undermine the importance of autonomy, but again, really reframes it as an interdependent notion. That yes, we are all self-regulated, autonomous professionals, but we all come together and are interdependent on each other in order to really fulfill excellence in patient care, patient outcomes. So it is, yes, we are all individually autonomous, but we are interdependent on each other in order to really achieve excellence. So it's really looking at the notion about mutuality, respect, non-coercion, really that looks at the whole notion about how does that create those underlying concepts, and how do we look at the whole notion about the coming of together, but in a non-coercive intersect in terms of really looking at goal setting. So what is a moral and ethical community? How is it to be ethical and act ethically? And it is with the very principles, as you can see there, in terms of it is a notion about a democracy. Yes, there are power differentials. Physicians have more controlled acts than we do. But it is about coming together within the philosophy and the principles of democracy in terms of everyone having equitable access and input into the overall plan of care, or creating that moral community. It is about equity, justice, and underlying respect for what we each individually and collectively bring to our own experience, as well as to the healthcare experience as well. And I really thought that these particular scenarios are really quite telling. How do preconceived ideas influence relationships at work? So the first scenario, where the typical routine was the psychiatric mental health nurse provided the assessment, kind of started rounds going, everybody added their 2 cents in. The new docs that came in were having none of that, and again, we're really quite dismissive. Because their assumption was that they've got the plan, and that's all they really needed, to be perfectly honest. So again, it's about the valuing, respecting, and honoring what everybody brings, and recognizing the interdependence that we all bring. The second scenario, in terms of, again, where the physician wanted the direct admit, the policy was a no. He just ran right over the top of that, the nurse and the manager, the director, and the ensuing onslaught after that, in terms of the disciplinary letters, the emails that came out, to the point where then the one individual actually ended up resigning. So again, it's that whole notion, even from a these would be interesting scenarios to take apart, looking at the variety of ethical theories here. So from a deontological perspective, we have a rule, if you will, or a policy about how patients get admitted. If that's the policy, then that's how it should be applied every single time. The notion about virtue ethics, in terms of, is this a good right way to act? What are the consequences as a result of this, in terms of the negative impacts on individuals simply for following the policy? So again, looking at the preconceived notion from the physician perspective as, I will decide, and I have more power, and therefore my voice obviously got listened to. So you can imagine, with both of these examples, in terms of the impact that would have in terms of the overall moral community. For here, it's more so at the team level, in terms of the notion of nursing feeling respected as a member of the team. From here on, it's a much grander scale level, in terms of almost the corporate culture, with regards to that sense of what is right, moral, and ethical. So again, I think really, really great examples, and the article was really quite good about walking you through the various different ethical theories that apply there. And really look at it in terms of how do we really look at the balance between values, my personal values and virtues, should be expressed, and which ways, but also being repressed in order to foster that moral community. Being really quite self-aware about what it is that I'm contributing, perhaps not contributing, and how do we look at how does my individual actions and the actions of all others really kind of contribute to that overall moral community, and how does that ultimately really impact the patient care and patient experience. So lastly, I'm going to go back to this quote alone, in terms of, it's really about that, it is a moral act to function collaboratively, because we must really identify that individually we cannot account for the full diversity of healthcare needs and really address the complexity. So it really is about that collaborative practice. And again, some of you have seen this slide before. This is more so about role clarity. But if we don't come together and truly understand how we function together as a collective group of healthcare professionals, ultimately patient care is potentially at risk, and it can actually become a significant patient safety issue. Lastly, what I'd like to suggest as an optional exercise, and again, it's optional, there are no grades assigned to this, is to perhaps look at the scenario of interprofessional rounds. This is something that happens all the time. So take a think of, perhaps take a whack at this. There's a constant issue where we work that the timing for interprofessional rounds is just not convenient for nursing, and therefore nursing does not have the ability to actually attend rounds, to bring information to rounds about the various patients and their care, but also to hear from the other professionals as well. So this is an ethical issue. It's not just a logistical issue, it's an ethical issue. So, have a think about it. What, if this was going on in your organization, what do you see as the ethical implications of this, i.e. nursing not going to rounds or not being able to attend rounds? What are some of the ethical issues here? What ethical theory or theories do you think might apply here? And to start getting used to using the decision-making framework, apply one of the decision-making frameworks and perhaps come up with what you think would be an option that maximizes the good to actually resolve this issue. So I've created a discussion forum for you to do this. And again, I look forward to seeing what you have to think about this particular idea. Okay, have a good day. Bye.